Let me welcome you again to the 10th meeting of the Spatial Productivity Lab. It will be devoted to the link between business incentives and business entry. It is my pleasure to have you with us. And before I will pass the floor to other speakers, I would like to say a few words about the Spatial Productivity Lab. So we are a more research-oriented unit within the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. And we are hosted by the OECD Trento Centre for Local Development. The team of the lab is composed of economists based here in Trento, but also based in Paris. We do empirical research on subnational drivers of productivity. So the idea is to build up a knowledge base which can be used for policy design with the goal of increasing aggregate productivity, but probably most importantly, to decrease the interregional inequalities. We have a growing network of knowledge partners, and some of them are participating in this meeting, which is our pleasure, of course. We are also open to collaboration on research projects, so I would be the contact person for this. And we are, in a sense, linking academic research to more policy-oriented work performed by OECD. So we are in between of academia and our policy work, and it's our pleasure to be this conduit. We are also open to partnerships with research organizations on the topics of subnational productivity performance. So coming back to our meeting today, we'll be talking, as I said, about the link between business incentives and firm entry. And this meeting is organized in partnership with one of our international partners, Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. And it's my pleasure to invite Johan Eklund, who is Managing Director of the Forum, to offer his welcome remarks and to chair this webinar. Johan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here and a pleasure to co-organize this webinar. As Alexandra said, I am the Managing Director of Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. And we are a research foundation based in Sweden, and we're, as our name reveals, we're interested in issues relating to entrepreneurship, firm dynamics, and economic renewal. And our interests, so to speak, overlaps quite a lot with what Alexandra described here in terms of we like to bridge the gap between policymaking and research and engage in a dialogue here. And those are, I'm not going to elaborate too much on what we do, but those who are interested in entrepreneurship, the Swedish economy, Swedish economic development, policy and research, and how these topics connect, we are quite happy to engage in a dialogue. And my capacity here today is to be, I'll try to share the session and allot the time and ask questions, but I'll give a very brief backdrop to why we're decided to organize this webinar. We're all aware that we're experiencing very turbulent times, and we're currently observing, and I'm observing this with, we are observing this with Swedish data, quite dramatic reallocation of resources and possibly changing entrepreneurial dynamics as a consequence of the pandemic. And we're seeing this redistribution of resources across regions globally. And to my opinion, or in my mind, informed policymaking as well as research and engaging a dialogue becomes critically important in this context. And just to give one very brief example from the how this is important in the Swedish context, just over the last couple of days, there's been a renewed public debate on, or discussion on, the role of is it worthwhile incentivizing new firm formation? What role does small new firms play in terms of inducing innovations, and what role does entrepreneurship and have in connection to innovations. And with this very brief backdrop, I would like to briefly give an introduction to today's speaker before I give the floor to the first speaker. Can I have next slide, please? Thank you. So we have, starting with the concluding remarks, we have Dr. Sameksha Desai, who is the Director of Knowledge Creation and Research at the Kaufman Foundation. She's also active at the Indiana University, and I'm happy to say affiliated with the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. And I'll keep the introduction brief here. You all have access to the biographies of our distinguished speakers. So I encourage you to have to look at this. First in the speaking order, we have Carly-Ann Patrick. She's an associate professor at Georgia State University and has an impressive number of publications as well as an impressive number of academic research awards. Then we have Antonio Ashituru, Head of Research Analysis and Regional Division of the Trento branch of Bank of Italy. Antonio have worked globally and in particular served in various capacities at the University of California, Berkeley, US, UK, London School of Economics in the UK, etc. Then we have Joachim Appelqvist, who is the Deputy Director General of Vinnova. Vinnova is the Swedish innovation agency who manages quite a substantial budget which is directed towards increasing the innovation capacity and encourage entrepreneurship in the Swedish economy. Joachim has, apart from a distinguished policy career, also holds a PhD in economics. Then we have Albert Bravo Biosca, who was the founding director of Innovation Growth Lab, EGL, at Nesta, who actually in some ways very similar to what we want to achieve here, brings together governments, foundations, and researchers in order to create and come up with new solutions, how to encourage new policies to encourage innovation. Albert holds a PhD from Harvard University. And then we have, last but not least, very distinguished scholar and Salvatore Cecchini, who has studied at Columbia University, Wharton School of Finance and Department of Economics, has a long distinguished career both within IMF and the OECD, has served as, I believe, as an advisor to several ministers of finance and economics in Italy, and of course published extensively on today's topic. With those very brief introductory words, I would like to give the floor to Carly-Ann, who's going to give the first presentation. And I would like to just, before I give the word to you, Carly-Ann, please keep in mind that we probably have a lot of questions and we would like to have time for Q&A. So please keep the time. Floor is yours.
Thank you. And I will definitely try to keep the time to 15 minutes. So I am going to talk to you today about some recent research that some co-authors and I, Mark Partridge, Alexandra Svetkova, who's here on the call with us, and Sydney Schreier have recently completed on the effects of economic incentives on business startups in the United States. And so we are going to be looking at US data, although I think several of our lessons can be used in other parts of the world. Next slide. Whoop. Too many slides? So it should say focus on incentives and startups. The first slide. There we go. Whoop. There we go. Okay. So I think Johan already alluded to why we might want to focus on incentives in startups, but I'm just going to reiterate a few things. The research is fairly clear at this point that startups are central drivers of regional growth. And this can be linked to job creation, to having larger multiplier effects because they buy more local inputs. And what's most interesting is this effect seems to be most important in regions that are already lagging. So this is particularly important for policy goals, but it also suggests that they are a reasonable candidate for policy support. On the other side of that, there are a lot of state and local business incentives that are being used in the US. In 2015, estimates are roughly $45 billion, although there are some estimates that would say that it's as much as $90 billion in that same year. And these incentives are supposed to stimulate entry, and they're supposed to stimulate job creation, and they're usually targeted at specific sectors. However, the actual evidence on their effectiveness is quite mixed, in part because people are using different methods, or they're looking at just the effect on the recipient firms rather than general equilibrium effects, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So in this research, including a large body, which I've contributed and some other people on this call have, we've begun to discover that when we look at more general equilibrium effects, incentives tend to have unintended consequences. For example, capital subsidies tend to induce capital labor substitution, meaning that they actually reduce job creation. There seems to be upward pressure on input prices and some crowding out effects. In general, this seems to be linked to the fact that larger firms are more likely to benefit from most economic development incentive policies. And this seems to be coming at the expense of startups and smaller firms. So this suggests that we really don't know how effective these business incentives are going to be at the regional level in terms of stimulating overall growth. So next slide. So our study is going to try and answer two research questions. We're going to ask broadly, what are the effects of economic incentives on business entry in U.S. counties? And our data are going to allow us to look at the effects differentially by sectors and industries. And today I'm going to talk about just a few of the sectors and industries, but in the paper we go through an extensive analysis of quite a few sectors and industries. Next slide, please. So we're going to be looking at data from 2001 to 2013 in the United States. We're going to be looking at 246 counties across 36 metropolitan areas, and these, 47 metropolitan areas. These 47 metro areas are the largest and most economically important in each of their 33 states. And together they represent about 92% of US GDP. So we've got pretty good coverage. I'm going to focus today on our estimates that use this Lubel IV approach, but everything that I'm going to present to you was confirmed with all of the other estimation approaches that we have listed there. In fact, the ones that I'm going to show you are actually probably our most conservative estimates of the effects that we see. We're going to be looking at entries in these counties by industry, very detailed, as well as total. And we were able to access some confidential data from the US Census Bureau to look at these entries and have really detailed information on them. So we're not looking at existing employers, just new firms, so startups in their particular locations. We're also going to be using what is currently the most comprehensive data set available on the standard package of incentives across industries in each of these metropolitan areas, as well as the tax burdens for each of these industries. And this was provided to us confidentially by the W.E. Upjohn Institute. They have a version of this data that is available at the state level, and we were able to get the city level data from them. Of course, one of the things that we're going to be worried about is that the amount of incentives that are being offered could be causing job creation, but at the same, or startups, but startups and startup activity could also be causing the amount of incentives. So we're going to address this endogeneity issue by instrumenting for our incentives in the analysis. Next slide, please. So essentially what we're going to do is run a 3-year difference model over this time period where we've instrumented for the incentives using something that I created from state constitutions. And so there's a whole nother paper on this incentive, but essentially we're using provisions in state constitutions that limit and structure the way in which incentives can be used in various states and how they can be financed. It's essentially a measure of how easy governments can aid business and at what level they can aid businesses. The really nice thing about these is these state constitutional provisions actually came into being in the 19th century in response to economic development crises of the time associated with railroads and canals, but they're still in place today. So that's what we're going to use to instrument for the incentives. And then we're going to use a whole host of control variables that we think are important, although most of them are going to be lagged again so that we don't have to worry about any simultaneity issues. Next slide. So we're going to use an industry mix demand shifter, which is also an instrument. We're going to use this because we want to account for the fact that any kind of positive shock to local industry demand could have a positive effect or on startups, as well as a negative shock could have a negative effect. So we want to take account of that. We're also going to use lagged education, population, and industry structure. Importantly, we're going to use another measure that turns out to be really highly correlated with what's going on with startup activity in these areas. And it's a measure of job flows. And essentially, this is a measure of how easily a worker can move to another industry if they choose within the same labor market. And so we're going to use year and period fixed effects to deal with, sort of common macro shocks and state fixed effects to deal with common state policy changes. Next slide, please. And so our results are here. And the way to read this is the top line, total incentives, export industry incentives, and manufacturing incentives is telling us which type of incentive we're measuring. So total incentives is an average measure of all industry incentives. Export industry incentives are the incentives for just the export industry, and manufacturing is just for manufacturing industries. The next line of column headings, total export and high R&D, tells us the startup industry that we're interested in. So total is total startups, export is total export startups, and then high R&D startups. So if you look here, you can see that total incentives have a negative and significant effect on total startups. We see the same thing and even stronger for incentives targeting export industries, and about the same for manufacturing industries. So this suggests that there are, in fact, some crowding out. A couple other things to note here. If you look at the effect of the industry mix, so this is positive shocks, the negative effect of the incentives is about 1/3 the effect of the positive shock. So this gives you some sense of the importance or the economic significance of this decline in startups. Also interesting is that about 1/3 of the positive shock to local demand is giving us or is in jobs flow. So we've got this other positive effect happening with labor markets, which ease transitions for workers. Next slide. So we've got the same thing here, only now we're looking at incentives that are targeting high, medium, and low R&D manufacturing facilities. And again, the effect is significant and negative in most cases, or no effect otherwise. But we see exactly what we would have expected from industry mix, those positive shocks having positive effects on startups and job flows having positive effects on startups. This evidence from these two slides is not consistent with the idea that these incentives induce this large positive multiplier effect, which includes firm entry. And it's largely because they tend to be focused on large existing businesses. Next slide, please. So our results are going to suggest that overall incentives have no or negative effects on firm industry, either in the industry receiving the incentives or overall. And that it's a significant decline in total startups associated with an increase in these incentives. And we find that this is particularly true for export industries and manufacturing industry incentives. So in total, this suggests that incentives are crowding out new firms, and that the crowd out effect is so large that it offsets any effect incentives might have on attracting new firms to the area. Next slide, please. So, like I said, local demand shocks and intersector job mobility are both positively associated with higher startups. And I think this idea of intersector job mobility is one we should think a little bit more about. And it suggests that other policies that aren't necessarily economic development incentives may be having an effect on startup activity. We do this across a variety of industries, and we do a bunch of different models, and the results are very consistent. But I do want to make one caveat about the results. It is possible that the firms that receive the incentives have some sort of improved performance that offsets these crowding out effects, and we are not measuring that. So if the ones that receive the incentives have these positive effects that outweigh, then we could see overall positive effects in the region. However, current economic research on the topic does not suggest that this is likely, but I think we should be aware that that is at least a possibility. And I think that's it for me. I'll be happy to take questions as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Carl-Jan. I believe you kept your time perfectly, but to stay on track, I think we have a few questions for you, and I think some of the audience, including myself, would like you to elaborate in the panel discussion and in the Q&A session on what you put in the word or the meaning of incentive. So you could elaborate a bit on that. But let us come back to that and move directly to Antonio and give him the floor. So Antonio, the floor is yours for your presentation. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for listening. what I'm going to present today is actually a paper. It is a narrower paper compared with the Carrian's one. And if you can move to the next slide. Actually, okay, let me skip all the introduction and presentation, because actually Carrian made a great job in introducing the topic, so the topic of incentives. And what I'm going to present today is actually a paper that is a policy evaluation paper that aims at evaluating a set of policies that were put forward by the autonomous provinces of Trento and Bolzano to subsidize the entry of innovative firms. So the structure of the work is, okay, the first part is pretty classic. I make a classic policy evaluation exercise, and I actually try to evaluate whether those incentives were actually able to increase firm creation at local level. And I do this by using regression discontinuity design. I mean, this is just a technicality. Throughout this presentation, I will skip all technicalities. So if you want to have more details on this, just ask. And then in the second part of the paper, I try to make something that is usually not done in this kind of literature. It is actually, I try to make some calculations, some back of the envelope calculation on the gross economic benefits that these kind of policies generate at local level, and then compare these gross economic benefits with the cost of the policies. So it is basically a cost-benefit analysis, but okay, I will be more detailed in the next slide. Next. So actually, just let me show you a preview of the results. Actually, these policies that I have evaluated were successful in their stated aim. So basically, they were able to increase the probability to create a firm by applicants by something like a 30-40 percentage points, while basically the probability to entry, so the probability to create a firm by an applicant that didn't win, so that wasn't treated actually by the policy, was 50%. So it was actually to almost double the probability for a prospective entrepreneur to create a new innovative firm. But then if we go to the calculation of the benefits of the policy, well, basically, okay, in this presentation, I will just focus on the value added created by these newly formed firms. And basically in the first 3 years, by accumulating basically the value added created by the firms in the first 3 years, the benefit of the policies was 900k euros. That is actually something like 11% with the respect to the total cost of the subsidies. So basically, just to give you a preview of the results, that is also the take-home message of the paper. This policy was successful in the stated aim, but probably it was a bit too costly with respect to the actual benefits that were created at local level. Next. Okay, just to give you some details on what I'm going to evaluate here. Basically, I'm going to evaluate 7 programs. 5 were put forward by the province of Trento and 2 by the province of Bolzano. Actually, just to give you some institutional background on this, actually both provinces are well known in Italy for being very active in stimulating local economic activity, with the province of Trento that is well known for being very focused on innovative activities. basically these programs were slightly different among each other. In particular, those of the province of Trento was actually aimed at financing a specific list of activities that are usually considered something like a sunk cost for the creation of new innovative firms, like market analysis, the drafting of business plans, and so forth. While the programs by the province of Bolzano were aimed at financing the equity of new firms. How the technical was, how the selection was made, basically, okay, in general, the applications were evaluated by two distinct committees, a technical committee that was actually evaluating the scientific relevance and the technical feasibility of the project, and an economic committee that was actually basing its score on prospective economic growth, cooperation with university, and so on. The final score was actually the sum of these two scores. Next. And basically, we analyze and we use the official list of winner-losers for each tender that were provided by the provinces of Trento and Bolzano. So basically, our data set was made of name and surnames, and if we were lucky, the social security numbers of the applicants and the score. And we knew who was the winner and who was the loser in this case. Then we use this official list of winner-losers, so with these names and surnames, and we match this data set with the Infocamere data set. It is a data set with all the names and surnames of all the administrators of firms that are located in the provinces of Trento and Bolzano. And our outcome variable, our dependent variable, is whether the applicant actually created a firm after the start of the policy, and whether the firm was still active after 1, 2, and 3 years. We can't go beyond 3 years due to data availability. And since we have the scores that each applicant received, we use a regression discontinuity design that is actually quite good in identifying the causal effect of the policy. Next. So just let me give you some very brief descriptive statistics. Basically, the paper is here. So, okay, basically here we have the mean dependent variable for treated firms and non-treated firms. Just to give you an idea, okay, 1 year after the tender, basically a treated applicant, that is a winning applicant, had a probability of 86.8% to create a firm, while a losing applicant had a probability of 22.7%. As you can see, there is a huge difference in the probability to create a firm, but after 3 years, there is a slight convergence between these two probabilities. And this is mainly due to the fact that after 3 years, many non-treated applicants actually entered afterwards. So basically, they were probably able to find some external finance to finance their idea, and their project. Next. Okay. The next thing about the regression discontinuity design is that graphs explains everything. and here in this case, I just want to show you the results when we analyze the policy after 3 years. And basically, the vertical line is the cutoff. That is, it is the line that distinguishes those who were able to win the application that are on the right with those who were not able to win, so they lost on the left. As you can see, there is a jump in the probability to create a firm, and the size of this jump is of the magnitude that I was telling you before, so it is around 30–40 percentage points. Next up. This result is actually very robust. I won't go through all possible robustness checks, and I just want you to focus on the last two bullet points, and in particular, we also checked whether successful applicants were also able to increase their innovative activity measured by patents. Actually, we are not able to measure innovative activities in any other way, so in a more soft way. So basically, we actually check whether they were able to make more patent applications, or whether the patent application they made received more citations afterwards. And our results on innovative activities is basically zero. So we don't find that those who were treated were actually able to make more innovative activities than those who lost those tenders. Next slide. And then we go to the final part of the paper. So basically, so far we have found that there is a positive impact on the intended outcome. So those tenders were actually able to create new firms. But then we try to calculate whether the additional value added that were created by treated firm was actually to, exceed the cost of the policy. Why I focus mostly on value added, because it is a monetary measure, so it can be measured in euros. It can approximate the GDP. And how I do this is actually I impose some structure on the data. So I have actually to build something that is generally called a semi-structural model to those data. Why I have to do this? Because actually, as you have so in this case, we have to compare.
Sorry for interrupting. Can you repeat
Yes,
the
sir.
last 30 seconds? We had an interruption, I think. So if you can repeat the last thing you said.
Okay. Yes, your internet. Traded firms with the value added that would have been created without the subsidy by firms that would have been created anyway. So these are the results. Next slide. Okay. Just to give you an idea, just take the first line, this value-added line. Okay, in the first year, basically the policy created 137k euros. In the second year, 300k euros. In the fourth year, 455k euros. So if you accumulate the value added that was created in the first 3 years, basically we have this 900k figure that I was telling you before. And this is actually the value added created by, thanks to the policy, that is thanks to the more intense entry generated by the policy. And this compares actually with the total cost of the policy that was more than 8 million. So basically in the first 3 years, actually these policies were able to cover just the 11% of the total cost of the subsidies that were put on the ground by the autonomous provinces. Last slide. Okay, so these are basically the conclusions. So there are, as I said, our exercise was actually able to confirm that this kind of subsidies were actually effective in stimulating more intense entry, and the magnitude is also quite large. I mean, it is increased the probability to create a new company by more than 40 percentage points with respect to a laissez-faire scenario. So it is almost able to double the probability to create a new company. However, this result is somewhat, diminished in its initial optimism if we do compare the benefits of the policies with the total cost of the policy. And this is actually, as we found, actually the benefits of the policies calculated by the value added is just 11% of the total costs. Actually, these results is, are quite strong, and they probably are driven by some of the institutional characteristics of the Italian business environment. And actually this result that there are a lot of startups, but these startups are not able to create a very large value added for the entire economy. This is actually something that is also found in other papers that focus mostly on Italy. Thank you very
much. Thank you very much, Antonio. Very interesting. And unfortunately, we had a couple of very short interruptions in the connection, or at least I had. So, but I think we got the main message, and I encourage those who are participating here to send questions in the chat forum.
Sure.
I have a couple of more technical questions, but let's keep them for the Q&A and move ahead to the panelists and the discussion. So again, thank you. I suggest that we start out with, so we've just listened to two very interesting research papers that actually, in my mind, highlights the challenges for research and policy and for policymakers to navigate and make sense on what kind of guidance can research provide us to develop policy. So I suggest we start out with the broad questions, and perhaps if the panelists would like to, of course, you can comment directly on the papers, but elaborate on how you think business incentives are evolving and how they're affected by the COVID crisis, etc., and how you think that policy making in this area in a broad sense is developing and where we're moving. And then we can go into more specific questions. And I suggest we start with you, Joachim, and your background at Vinnova. And I know you, just to emphasize, you have a very significant portfolio at Vinnova with a huge heterogeneity in terms of the business incentives and the programs you have. And please, the floor is yours, and then we'll move through the panel.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Carl-Jan and Antonio. It was a very interesting papers. Was quite some time since I was diving into the research myself, so it was a flashback and a very enlightening flashback, to say the least. Well, just to highlight a few things that really popped out for me when listening to your presentations, I think this question on intersector job mobility is, of course, very interesting, representing an agency that provide funding for more selective innovation policy measures, really trying to stimulate collaboration and co-creation among different stakeholders in the Swedish economy, including academic partners, industry, and also public sector. I think this, what you highlight with this introducing that factor into your study is really the importance of having this flow of people and creating that structural dynamics in order to create long-term productivity growth and growth. So it's very interesting. And then really like to dive into your paper, Antonio, in terms of how you really measure. We've been struggling with the issues of capturing the effects of especially our SME programs, and especially in terms of data. I think one thing that we have highlighted, which I really would like to discuss further, is really the time horizon, because at least to our experience, 3 years is much too short a time period to capture at least where you try to address these highly innovative companies. So that would be very interesting to dive deeper into. And then we were asked the panelists to reflect on some issues connected to the current situation and with the COVID and how it affects the business incentives and also the policy situation. I would just mention a few things to not just to not take up too much of the time, but I think as you might understand, I think uncertainty, I mean, is really what is affecting, especially when working with innovation, to take on continued investments into future activities. So that really one thing that we hear. The reorganization of value chains, being in a country that have a large share of multinational companies being active, is really something that everybody struggles with, and how that will affect the long-term investments, including in R&D, is an issue top on the agenda. And then shortage of capital, I would say in some areas, not all across the board. And that also comes back to some of the opportunities that we have picked up investigating the companies in our portfolio. And then, of course, what really stands out is the massive digital transformation that is going on by necessity, since we're sitting in these meetings instead of meeting in beautiful Italy. So, and that has really created areas, including the academy, where you thought the digital transformation will happen perhaps with my grandkids, is happening like this. It's amazing to see the innovation capabilities that have been released, and also, of course, niche companies that has really emerged and benefited from this transformation in like home delivery, digital services, life sciences, of course. And then in terms of the policy responses from our part, what we really try to, and we've been working with that before the COVID hit, but I think especially in terms of SME programs, we're trying to have a more diversified approach. I think this one size fits all, creating like overall framework conditions, at least in the Swedish case, we see a decreasing effect of those measures. I think we really need to pinpoint what are the specific sectors that need the intervention of the government. And then we're especially talking about deep tech companies in like a wide sense, the ones that have a really wide valley of death, moving away for a lot of the digital companies. I mean, the digital innovation space, it's really well funded, at least in the Swedish case. So we need to move into other areas where more long-term capital is needed in different stages of the company's development. And then, but let's come back to that. I think there's also a way of addressing the uncertainty issues, and we're trying to move into another sphere of the academic literature concerning innovation policy, where there is much more stress on this creating directionality when it comes to the development of certain sectors, securing the incentives for businesses to make long-term investment, making sure that you do selection from a government point of view in terms of what areas to support long term, creating these incentives that can release a lot of private capital being invested in certain areas. Hydrogen is such an area of Sweden that is very important. I mean, and then a lot of the other different technical areas connected to climate change, for instance. So, but thank you very much. It was very inspiring to listen to the presentations.
Thank you very much, Joachim. I think if we have time, we'll come back to some of the issues you raised on the time horizon on evaluation, some of the methodological issues. But you mentioned directionality and selection of policy, and I think that's a perfect words to hand over to Albert. So floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity of being here today. I mean, I think we could spend the next days and weeks discussing about this and not get to, and it will be quite an enriching discussion. So given that I only have a few minutes, maybe there were kind of a couple ideas I wanted to share based on the questions that were raised on how do we ensure that we design more effective business incentives. And I think there are some things that there is wide agreement. We need to get the short-term response right so that we minimize the damage in the long term. There is an asymmetric shock. There are winners and losers. We need to think very carefully about how to spread the cost, and we need to be agile and acting very, very quickly while still keeping the options in the kind of long term of recovering some of the support that we've been putting. So I think on this there is lots of agreement. Maybe the question is how best to do it and how to ensure that that the limited resources that we have actually achieve the maximum impact. And that's precisely what the Innovation Growth Lab AGL was set up to do. For those of you, there is a little bit of a description on the bio, I believe, but for those of you that don't know it, it's basically a global initiative based on Nestor that brings together governments and researchers to test new ways of supporting innovation and entrepreneurship. Ultimately, the aim is developing more impactful policies by making them more experimental and more evidence-based. And maybe one of the questions that it's kind of useful to think about is, should we be actually thinking about policy experimentation right now? Is there the space? Shouldn't we? I mean, is it something? Is it something that can have an impact in the short term? And I would say the answer is yes. I mean, the reason to become more experimental is partly creating evidence of impact, but are partly also helping us to explore different options, different alternatives, de-risking the development of new policies, encouraging some novel ideas, and a dynamic of continuous improvement in the policies and programs that we do. And we've seen a lot of this happening in a somewhat not totally structured way, to put it. We've seen agencies, governments across Europe and across the OECD being extremely agile, launching new policies, new programs very quickly with a speed that we were not used to, which was a very welcome speed given the challenges that we had to address. But one of the questions is, can governments maintain some of this agility that they've demonstrated when they had no choice, but they had to be agile, they had to develop new policies quickly, they had to go out and basically test them and basically put them outside. Can we maintain some of that in the long term? I guess that's one of the questions, maybe just for all of us to think about. How do we keep that agility and that willingness to try new things relatively quickly? The other one, I guess, that it's a useful kind of idea to keep in mind is that if we want to ensure that the limited resources that we have the maximum impact, we need to think as much about the how as the how much. Maybe that's one of the kind of thoughts I had with the first presentation, which was quantifying business incentives as one thing. And to me, I think it's very important to really break the policy down into pieces. And very often it's the little details, the small changes in a program, in a policy that will make a huge difference. And putting everything together, it helps for the macro analysis, but actually we are missing an important part of the picture. I think looking at it would be useful to understand the diversity. So, I mean, going back to what I was saying earlier, is there, I guess, is there a role for an experimental mindset and experimentation to support the recovery in the short term, but also to contribute to the to long-term productivity growth? And I think kind of there are different ways that you could imagine this happening. On the one hand, we've seen many programs being launched by governments, some of which have had amazing take-up, but others actually have had very limited take-up. And one of the things that you could think about experimenting right now and with immediate impacts is actually, how do we experiment? What are the more effective ways to increase the take-up of the programs that we have? This is sort of optimizing policies at the margin, but actually sometimes this is the difference between getting a very large take-up of a financial support scheme or getting a very small take-up, and that's the difference between companies surviving or not. So there is something, I guess, in this space that could be done, and this is just an example of thinking about what can be different ways of optimizing the delivery of the short-term policies and programs that we are having. But I think policy experimentation is also compatible with providing larger scale immediate support. While ideally, we think about experiments as starting small, then testing out different options, and then scaling them up. And that's, in an ideal sense, that's how you would like to do it. If there is an urgent need, there are ways of starting large scale, for instance, to support digitization among SMEs, and testing kind of different ways of doing that as a way that, in the short term, you learn something and you're having an impact, and also you're putting the foundations for learning much more in the long term. The other thing I think that just, and that will be my final thought is one of the things that it's clear is that this crisis will not be a V-shaped recovery. Things go down, then they go up quickly. We'll have to plan for a long-term recovery, and we'll still have the challenges that we had before about slowing productivity growth and so on. So it also makes sense to think right now, as there are, for instance, new funds being made available by the Commission with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, of how do we use that funding in the most effective way. And here there are examples that that I think are very interesting. Like, for instance, the UK has launched an experimentation fund, and the idea is recognizing that the government doesn't know all the answers, and is it the organizations who work with entrepreneurs, who work with businesses, who work with SMEs that really typically may be the source of the best ideas on how to support them. It's creating a mechanism to, on the one hand, identify these ideas, help them, support them into well-designed programs, and then actually fund them to test those, so that you can build the evidence and learn whether these programs work and then should be scaled up. This will not have an immediate effect on the recovery in the next few months, but it will put the basis for things that for much more impactful programs in the future. And actually, my last thought will be, this is something that, talking to Commission officials, one of the things that they've said publicly is that they would like to see that the submissions, the programs of work that the governments are submitting for the new Horizon, for the new European Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is something like 50 billion of funding. They would like to see kind of member states embedding some policy experimentation on those proposals. So I'll just probably leave it here and open up to give the floor back to Johan.
Thank you very much, Albert. I think we could spend quite some time on talking about experiments only and experimental design. But you posed a question, how to best do it, I think was your words. And with those words, I hand over the word to Salvatore, who has a long experience in this area. So what is your answer to that and your reflections? The floor is yours, Salvatore.
Okay, I would like to address squarely the two questions that were raised for the panel discussion that are related to the current period of COVID pandemic. But before doing so, I would like to say we had two good papers, but still on the first paper, it seems to me that it boils down to the design of the incentive and the targeted group. So no wonder if that is the approach, you get those results. And on the second paper, I would say that the testing period of 3 years seems too short, because it's just towards the end of the death valley. So I would like to see a test over 5 and more years to take account of the long-term impact. Now, let me turn to the first question, obstacles, opportunities to fair formation. Well, I think a policymaker has to look at data, first of all. You cannot make a policy if you don't have some evidence, whatever evidence, but still it's evidence. And the evidence for Europe this time is missing, but in my country, there is evidence. The evidence is that during the first 3 quarters of the current year, the number of newly started enterprises was positive, although declining, and the net balance compared to the closing down of enterprises is still positive. So we have still a flow of new startups, we have a positive net balance, and we also have an increase in the number of innovative startups that receive a special treatment by the government. How do you explain these trends in spite of the difficult current economic conditions? Well, one is new business opportunities have been generated by the pandemic itself. Second, the easy money policy and the support measures provided by the government. Third, some of these startups are out of necessity and not out of business opportunities. And the final point is that a number of these innovative startups come out of universities. They are spillovers of university centers. But the upshot of all this is that right now, all the external conditions for a startup are negative because you have declining sales, lack of demand, restrictions, breakdown of relationships between enterprises, breakdown of connections between enterprises and universities, and so forth and so forth. So I think that now we have to focus on 3 major stumbling blocks. First, the business framework conditions. Second, the funding. Third, this breakdown of B2B, B2C business research or research industry that has taken place and that shows up in the reshoring tendency and on the decline of certain value chains. Governments have tried to address these challenges by adopting a vast array of measures that were directed to both existing firms and startups, but with different approaches, different types of incentives. And if you analyze the policies across OECD countries, you realize that there are wide differences across OECD countries, but there are also common trends. And you have differences also across sectors and between large companies, SMEs, and startups. On the top of all this, you see that the mix of instruments that have been used to support, to incentivize startups is different from what is used for other enterprises. Take, for instance, a startup. A startup lacks equity capital, so there is no point giving a tax credit to a startup because you know that a startup has a low probability of generating enough earnings in the first 3-4 years because of its very nature, particularly if it's an innovative one. Second point, same applies to a guarantee, but if you give a guarantee to a loan, then you get into the problem of excessive leverage, excessive financial leverage, which is the problem that now have most of the enterprises and which should be sorted out somehow. Now, if you look at certain econometric studies on the additionality impact of incentives in terms of input, that is to say, additional investment of enterprises, for instance, in R&D, as compared to what is provided by the government, you see that the impact is very much different according to the size of the firm. For small firms, the impact is much higher. I cannot dig into this topic, but what I want to stress is 3 points. First, you have to mix hard incentives with soft incentives. What do I mean by soft incentive? I mean non-financial support like mentoring services, simplification of administrative and tax procedures, public procurement that is devoted to startups, because this is a major factor at the moment when you have a lack of aggregate demands. You have to provide also some ready-made approaches to address digitalization, because quite often startups are not so capable of handling the digitalization of their firm. Other areas can be considered, but governments have to consider also some snags. First, targeting the wrong entrepreneurs that are less in need of support. Second, delays in the implementation of the support measures. Third, the support measure being used for other purposes. And fourth, the inadequacy of support as compared to the manifested needs. To conclude, policymakers and policy guidelines have to bear in mind that they have to distinguish modalities of support and size of support. They have to make sure that the beneficiary enterprises understand that the support is of a temporary nature. So you don't create a dependency over the longer term to assistance by the government. Third, governments have to improve the business environment, the business habitat for all enterprises, but particularly for startups. And finally, the question of macroeconomic management that has to provide a way out of the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salvatore. I realize we have quite enough material for a follow-up webinar. We have about 20 minutes left, and I would like for Sami to have some time to wrap up. So let me turn to you, Carl-Jan and Antonio. Can you, if you would like to address some of the issues raised here, and for you, Carl-Jan, if you would like to just briefly elaborate on your thoughts on what you put in the word of incentive, I think that would help me at least. So
yeah, absolutely. So we focus on a particular set of incentives that are essentially the standard deal for a medium-sized company. And that when we say incentives, we're looking, the calculation includes any property tax abatements, which is a large tool here in the United States, customized job training subsidies, investment tax credits, job creation tax credits, and research and development tax credits. We do not include discretionary incentives or deal closing incentives, which would typically go to larger firms. And we have a separate measure that's actually calculating tax burden. So the tax burden would include things like sales tax exemptions and that sort of thing. So that's a separate measure. The incentives are these property tax abatements, customized job training subsidies, and investment tax credits, job creation and R&D that would be typical. So these would be something that almost any medium-sized or larger business would get in these locations if they met the industrial qualifications. And so I think to kind of address some of the points, we are thinking about a particular set of incentives. I don't think what I found and what Antonio found are actually inconsistent with each other, because these are for larger, they're not targeting small businesses and or startups. And but I think what my results suggest is that even when we target other types of industry, it's not neutral with regards to startups. And I think when we start to think about spreading limited resources in the post-COVID environment, we need to be aware of the fact that there are trade-offs with these policies, even if it's not associated with the targeted industries, that there are these general equilibrium effects. And what we found here is consistent with other results that I found for things like large firm subsidies, where we have this kind of crowding out effect. And right now, most resources go to larger firms, or even in the United States, when we think small business, that definition goes up to 500 employees, which is not a startup, right? That's a relatively large. And part of that is because they have political power. They're very good at organizing. They're very good at also taking advantage of these relief programs that have been rolled out since COVID. And if you find they're more quick on the take up of these relief programs than small businesses. And I think our results suggest that if we want to really think about how to help startups and long-term entrepreneurship in a post-COVID environment, we need to think about these trade-offs and really think about policies that are focused on that group that has little organizing power, little political power, and is much, much slower on the take-up of these relief programs than large businesses. And I'm going to leave it at that because I know we're short on time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was clarifying. Antonio, I'm turning directly to you. And I take the liberty to come back to a question of time horizon, as well as the question of what you look at is, if I understand it correctly, is private returns. And there has been a discussion, I believe, Vinnova and others, at least in Sweden, have been talking about the social returns because you want to create knowledge spillovers, etc. How would you like to address that question, perhaps?
Yes, thanks, and thanks for the questions. Okay, regarding the time horizon, okay, let me give you the practitioner answer and the policy analyst answer. Okay, the practitioner answer is that basically I was forced to use a 3 years horizon because actually some of these policies were very recent. So it was actually the maximum length possible. But let me also just say that all these policies had a 3 years time horizon. Just to be a bit more clear, actually, firms that received those subsidies actually were forced to stay in the provinces of Trento and Bolzano for at least 3 years. Then they could move. So actually, the time horizon of the policy was actually 3 years. That was probably too short. It is probably a problem of the design of the policy, but this was exactly its horizon. Now, let me move a little bit on a more general question about spillovers. Okay, if you look at the paper, actually, I am quite aware that the value added created by the policy is actually a value added that doesn't take into account the innovation spillovers on other firms or on the local environment, and this is actually a limitation of the analysis. But let me also say that at the end, these policies were extremely costly. Actually, if you look at the subsidy per firm that are given by the provinces of Trento and Bolzano, is actually almost the double with respect to the average subsidy that is given by regional governments in Italy. But indeed, they were benefiting a very, very small number of firms. So basically, according to my calculations, actually, the firms that were actually created thanks to the policy were in both provinces, just summing up, they were 24. Now, we can also say that among these 24 firms that you can find a new Google, a new Facebook, and if you are lucky, you are, you won the jackpot. But I mean, they at the end, they were actually only able to create a very small number of firms. That, okay, we can discuss about it, but I mean, we can also think that maybe 24 firms in two provinces were a bit too small, I mean, in order to create a new Silicon Valley or something like that in these areas. Okay, this is my direct answers to your questions. I don't know whether there are other. I just wanted to add something about the previous discussion. Actually, probably, I mean, in this post-COVID environment, in which we have to recover from a very big economic loss, and especially in Italy, I mean, this big economic loss is coming after two other very big economic losses. I mean, in 2019, Italy didn't still recover the GDP of 2007. So this is something that we have to keep in mind if we analyze Italy. So basically, the need of structural reform, the need of increasing the growth patterns of the country is actually very, very important. The point, is that in Italy and also in the province of Trento, per esempio, there was a very, very big concentration on the creation of new firms, while probably the missing point was that new firms were created, but they were just staying there. I mean, they remained the size of a startup forever. I mean, they were just receiving funds for 7-10 years, and they were not growing. And that is probably the most important structural problem of the Italian economy, the Trentino economy, and so forth. Thank you. I hope I've answered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We are, as this is getting really interesting, we are running out of time. So I'm turning directly to Alexandra and Sameksha. Alexandra, do we have any quick questions, or shall we move directly to Sami?
I suggest we move to the closing remarks, and maybe if Sami can also touch upon a little bit on the role of exit now, because now it looks like that support is mostly devoted to keeping companies afloat as opposed to helping companies to enter. How long do we expect it to last? Whether it is totally wasteful, or is it something that we have to stick to for right now, but when is the right time to kind of switch to actually supporting startups as opposed to helping existing companies to survive? Thank you.
You're muted.
Okay, is this better? Okay, so thank you, Johan and Alexandra. There are, I think, two sets of thoughts that I'm taking away from this and from the very valuable research shared by our speakers. The first one is when we talk about incentive targets, it's important to make the distinction, and this is clear from the findings, between established businesses and new businesses. And so I think from a policy perspective, there is sometimes a tendency to think of all business as benefiting equally or as benefiting jointly from the same types of policies. And one of the things that this research really shows us is we want to think about how startups in particular may be affected by some of the incentives policies. Related to this, it's important to think also about spatial dynamics. And so, for example, in the United States, we have an interesting situation where there can be regions at the border of two jurisdictions. And you might actually see these jurisdictions almost competing in a way. And so one thing I think that we should be asking ourselves and really pushing to think about is, what is the goal? If the goal is new economic activity, then that is a bit different than the goal of, for example, moving jobs from one place to another. And so I think just really being able to disentangle the effects of incentives at the spatial dimension is important, particularly when you see regions that are part of multiple jurisdictions where you might see incentives being offered that compete with each other. And then I think the second broad set of questions is really about this post-COVID recovery, which is we are asking a lot of questions collectively about access to opportunity, about what's going to happen to groups that have traditionally faced inequities, and we know that these inequities can span a large number of situations. And so I'll give you the example, for example, of growing a business. We know capital is very important to grow a business. And if we know that large established businesses may face some advantages, we really want to think about, are we targeting, again, new activity, or are we targeting existing activity? I don't know what the answer is. That's for policymakers to decide, but some clarity around what the effects are would be very helpful. And then the other thing I want to share is, we now are seeing a flood of business exit. And so when you think about human capital and you think about labor markets, this now puts many former business owners who have grown businesses, who have successfully employed people, created new products, reached new markets, and achieved substantial experience. Many of them are now in a position where they're thinking about what is the next thing that they do. And so I think more than at any other time, we're in a position where there may be many potential startups in the next few years, and really thinking about how our incentives policies and how business policies more broadly will shape those decisions of those former business owners is a crucial part of the conversation. It's very unique, I think, to this COVID environment, but one of the big questions that we'll be facing. So, and I just want to thank the panelists and the presenters for their very valuable findings. I'll turn it back to Alexandra.
Thank you, Sami. That was really very enlightening, I think, especially highlighting the spatial dimension, but also the potential, which it seems to be accumulating right now at the moment. And it will be our common job to figure out how to use it and to make the most of this potential going forward. So I would like to thank everyone. It's very rare when we stay on time, but today we managed. Thank you so much to all participants who are still with us. Thank you to our experts. It was a pleasure to get to know you and to talk. And I would like to invite everybody who is interested to our next SPL meeting, which is scheduled for December 10th. The next meeting will be actually devoted to our host region. So if Antonia evoked any interest about Trentino and Bolzano, please join us. I hope we'll have a lot of insights about what's going on here locally, but I think it has implications for broader processes, because this region, at least locally in Italy and often actually internationally, is a case study and actually the lab for future developments in terms of policy and all the experiments that are expanded later. So it's a very interesting environment here. And if you are interested, please join us on December 10th. Thank you so much.